My name is Joaquin Morales, and I'm a bounty hunter who survived the first 24 hours of the zombie outbreak in Atlanta. When I walked into Grady Memorial Hospital chasing a bail jumper on October 15, 2024, I thought I was ending a routine hunt. Instead, I witnessed the beginning of the apocalypse. What I saw that day changed everything I believed about survival, justice, and what it means to be human. Before we start the video, let us know what country you are tuning in from in the comment section below. Perhaps we will make a story there. Let's begin. If you're watching this, then you're a survivor like me. My name is Joaquin Morales, and I need to tell you exactly what happened during those first 24 hours when everything changed. Not because I want to relive it, but because the information I'm about to share might save your life. Every detail matters now. Every mistake I made, every choice that kept me breathing, every pattern I noticed about those things that used to be people. You need to know it all. I was a bounty hunter before the outbreak. For 12 years, I tracked down fugitives who skipped bail, brought them back alive, and collected my fee. That was my world, simple, predictable. I had rules. I never killed anyone. I never hunted innocent people. I believed in justice, in giving everyone a fair chance in court. Those beliefs shaped every decision I made, right up until the moment they almost got me killed. The morning of October 15, 2024, started like any other Tuesday. I was tracking a bail jumper named Carlos Rodriguez through downtown Atlanta. Rodriguez had missed his court date for armed robbery, and his bail bondsman wanted him back. Nothing unusual about that. I'd been doing this kind of work since I left the border patrol 6 years earlier. Before that, I spent 4 years as military police in the Army. All of it prepared me for reading people, understanding their patterns, predicting where they'd run when cornered. Rodriguez was a small-time criminal from East Atlanta, 28 years old, priors for theft and assault, but nothing that suggested he was particularly dangerous. His bail was set at $50,000, which meant I'd collect $5,000 for bringing him in, standard rate. I'd been tracking him for 3 days, following a trail of credit card transactions and witness sightings that led me through half the city. What I remember most about that morning was the radio chatter. I always kept my scanner tuned to police frequencies while I worked. Information is everything in my line of work. You need to know where the cops are, what they're responding to, whether your target might be connected to other crimes. That Tuesday morning, there was more chatter than usual. Not dramatically more, just enough to make me notice. Around 8 in the morning, I heard dispatch sending units to Emory University Hospital for what they called a disturbance. The details were vague. Something about a patient attacking medical staff. I thought it was probably a psychiatric episode, or someone high on drugs. Hospitals deal with that kind of thing all the time. I filed it away and kept focused on Rodriguez. An hour later, there was another call. This time to Georgia Baptist Hospital. Another patient incident, similar circumstances. Then another call to Piedmont Hospital around 10:30. I started paying closer attention. 3 hospitals in 2.5 hours, all reporting patient attacks on staff. That was unusual, but not unprecedented. Maybe it was a bad batch of synthetic drugs making the rounds. Maybe it was just coincidence. I'd been tracking Rodriguez since dawn, following him through the MARTA system using security footage and witness reports. He was good at staying mobile, but he made mistakes. He used his girlfriend's credit card at a gas station on Ponce de Leon Avenue. He was spotted at a McDonald's on North Avenue by someone who recognized him from a wanted poster. Small errors, but they created a pattern one could follow. By noon, I had him narrowed down to his 6-block area around the Georgia State University campus. Rodriguez had friends in that neighborhood, places he could lay low while he figured out his next move. I was methodical about it. I interviewed shop owners, checked with my contacts in the area, built a timeline of his movements. This was what I was good at. Reading the story that every fugitive leaves behind. The radio chatter kept escalating throughout the day. By 1 o'clock I was hearing calls about incidents at 6 different hospitals across the metro area. The terminology was getting more specific too. Dispatch was using codes I recognized from my time in law enforcement. Code Gray meant security threat. Code Silver meant weapon. Code Black meant bomb threat. But they were also using combinations I'd never heard before. Around 2 in the afternoon, I got a solid lead. A homeless man I'd worked with before told me he'd seen Rodriguez heading toward the downtown area, specifically toward the hospitals. That struck me as odd. Rodriguez wasn't the type to seek medical attention, and he wasn't stupid enough to hide somewhere with heavy security. Unless he was more desperate then, I thought. I remember thinking about my father while I drove through downtown Atlanta that afternoon. He'd been a mechanic his whole life, worked with his hands, fixed things that were broken. Simple work with tangible results. Sometimes I wondered if I should have stayed in the family business instead of chasing criminals through the streets. My mother always worried about the danger in my job, but I told her I was careful. I had training. I had rules that kept me safe. The radio traffic was getting intense by 3 o'clock. I was hearing about incidents at more than a dozen hospitals now, and dispatch was struggling to keep up. They were calling in off-duty officers, requesting mutual aid from surrounding counties. Something big was happening, but nobody seemed to understand what it was. The reports were inconsistent. Some mentioned patients attacking staff. Others talked about contamination concerns. A few mentioned the CDC, which made sense since their headquarters was here in Atlanta. I found Rodriguez's car parked in a structure 3 blocks from Grady Memorial Hospital. It was a stolen Honda Civic, reported missing 2 days earlier from a parking lot in Decatur. He'd been using it to stay mobile, but now it was abandoned. That told me he was either planning to steal another vehicle or he was holed up somewhere. Nearby, Grady was the obvious choice. It was big enough to hide in, busy enough that security couldn't watch every entrance, and close enough to public transportation if he needed to run. Grady Memorial Hospital is a massive complex in downtown Atlanta. It's the primary trauma center for the region, with over 900 beds and thousands of staff members. If Rodriguez wanted to disappear in a crowd, it was a smart choice. If he wanted to avoid security cameras, it was a terrible choice. But criminals rarely think that far ahead. I spent an hour surveying the hospital grounds, looking for signs of Rodriguez. I checked the emergency department, the main lobby, the parking areas. Nothing. My contacts in hospital security hadn't seen him either. That meant he was either very good at staying hidden or he'd already moved on. I was starting to think I'd lost him when I spotted him in the parking garage. He was on the 3rd level, near the stairwell, looking nervous and checking his phone constantly. Classic behavior for someone planning their next move. I positioned myself where I could watch him without being seen. This was the part of the job I enjoyed most. The moment when all the investigation and tracking paid off, when you finally had eyes on your target. Rodriguez was carrying a backpack and wearing different clothes than he'd been seen in earlier. He'd changed his appearance, which showed he was thinking tactically. That made him more dangerous but also more predictable. People who are trying to alter their appearance usually have an exit strategy. They're planning to run, which means they'll stick to routes they know well. I was preparing to move in when the radio chatter exploded. Multiple units responding. To Grady Memorial Hospital, officer down, multiple casualties. Request immediate backup. The dispatcher's voice was tense, professional, but I could hear the strain underneath. Something was very wrong inside the building I was about to enter. That's when I had to make a choice. I could abort the pursuit, walk away from Rodriguez, and avoid whatever crisis was developing inside the hospital. Or I could continue with my job, trust my training, and adapt to whatever situation I encountered. I'd been hunting fugitives for 12 years. I'd dealt with violent criminals, domestic terrorists, and gang members. I thought I was ready for anything. Rodriguez was moving toward the stairwell when I heard the first scream. It came from inside the hospital, from one of the upper floors. Not a scream of pain or fear, but something else. Something that made every instinct I developed over 12 years of dangerous work tell me to run. The sound cut through the concrete and steel of the parking garage like it was nothing. I've heard people scream before. In combat, during arrests, in moments of genuine terror. This was different. It was raw, primal, like something had torn the humanity right out of someone's throat. The sound lasted maybe 3 seconds, but it changed everything. Rodriguez heard it too. He stopped moving, looked up at the hospital building, and I saw real fear in his eyes. More screams followed. Different voices, different floors, but all carrying that same inhuman quality. The radio chatter was getting chaotic now. Units were calling for medical assistance, for hazmat teams, for evacuation procedures. I heard codes being used that I didn't recognize, and dispatch was struggling to coordinate responses. Rodriguez made his decision. He started moving toward the exit, abandoning whatever plan had brought him to the hospital. Smart choice, but I had a job to do. I'd spent 3 days tracking him, and I wasn't going to let him walk away because of some hospital emergency. I had bills to pay, a reputation to maintain, and a professional obligation to the bondsman who'd hired me. I followed him toward the stairwell, staying back far enough that he wouldn't spot me. The screaming from inside the hospital was getting louder, more frequent. Whatever was happening in there was spreading. I could hear sirens approaching from multiple directions, see emergency lights reflecting off the concrete walls of the garage. That's when I heard Dr. Martinez screaming from the 4th floor. I knew her voice because I'd worked with her before on a case involving a fugitive who'd been admitted to the emergency department. She was a tough woman, someone who'd dealt with gunshot wounds and overdoses without flinching. Hearing her scream with that same inhuman quality made my blood run cold. Rodriguez was at the stairwell entrance now, but he'd stopped moving. He was staring up at the hospital building, listening to the chaos erupting inside. For a moment, I thought he might surrender. Sometimes fugitives get overwhelmed by circumstances beyond their control and just give up. But then he started moving again, heading for the street level. I had to make a choice. Continue pursuing Rodriguez or investigate what was happening in the hospital. My training said stick to the mission. Don't get distracted by other people's emergencies. Focus on your target and complete the job. But 12 years of bounty hunting had also taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that something was catastrophically wrong. The screaming from the hospital was constant now. Multiple voices, multiple floors, all carrying that same terrifying quality. I could see people running in the lobby, medical staff abandoning their posts, security guards speaking urgently into their radios. This wasn't a normal medical emergency. This was something else entirely. Rodriguez reached the street level and started moving toward the MARTA station. If he got on a train, I'd lose him in the transit system. I had maybe 2 minutes to decide whether to follow him or find out what was happening in the hospital. 2 minutes to choose between my professional obligation and my moral instinct to help people in danger. I chose to help. I abandoned my pursuit of Rodriguez and headed toward the hospital entrance. It was a decision that would save my life, though I didn't know it at the time. Rodriguez never made it to the MARTA station. I found his body 3 blocks away the next morning, torn apart by something that used to be human. The hospital lobby was in chaos when I entered. Nurses were running toward the elevators, their faces pale and their hands shaking. A security guard I recognized from previous visits was shouting into his radio, demanding backup from anyone who would listen. The normal sounds of a busy hospital had been replaced by something else. Screaming, crashing, and underneath it all, a sound I couldn't identify. Like growling, but wrong somehow. I approached the security guard, hoping to get information about what was happening. His name was Jenkins, and we'd worked together before when I'd needed to question patients about fugitives. He was a solid guy, former military, someone who stayed calm under pressure. But now he was sweating, his radio hand trembling as he tried to coordinate with other security personnel. He looked at me with relief when he recognized my face. Someone familiar in a world that had suddenly become alien. He told me that something was wrong with Dr. Chen on the 4th floor. She'd attacked Nurse Williams, bitten her, and was now moving through the hospital like a wild animal. Other patients were exhibiting similar behavior. The incidents were spreading faster than security could contain them. Jenkins asked me to help. He knew about my background in law enforcement, my training in dealing with violent individuals. He was overwhelmed, understaffed, and facing something he didn't understand. I agreed to assist, thinking I was walking into a psychiatric emergency or a drug-related incident. I had no idea I was about to encounter something that would fundamentally change everything I thought I knew about survival. I took the stairs to the 4th floor, my hand instinctively moving to the taser on my belt. I'd used it hundreds of times during arrests, and it had never failed to stop someone. 50,000 volts would drop anyone, regardless of their mental state or chemical impairment. I was confident in my equipment and my training. The 4th floor was a disaster zone. Broken glass scattered across the polished tiles, overturned equipment, and blood spattered on the walls in patterns that suggested extreme violence. The fluorescent lights were flickering, casting strange shadows that made everything look surreal. I could hear movement somewhere ahead, but I couldn't see the source. I followed the trail of destruction toward the nurse's station, my footsteps echoing in the unnatural quiet. The normal sounds of a hospital floor were gone. No beeping monitors, no conversation, no routine medical activity. Just the flickering lights and the sound of my own breathing. That's when I found Nurse Williams, or what was left of her. She was lying behind the nurse's station, her white uniform soaked with blood, her throat torn open. But the wounds weren't made by any weapon I recognized. They looked like bite marks, but deeper and more savage than anything a human could inflict. I knelt beside her, checking for signs of life, even though I knew it was too late. That's when I noticed the bite mark on her arm. Fresh, deep, and surrounded by swelling that suggested infection. I'd seen similar marks during my time on the border patrol, usually from dog attacks or wildlife encounters. But this was different. The edges were too clean, too deliberate. I heard footsteps approaching from the corridor behind me. Slow, unsteady, but purposeful. I turned, expecting to see another staff member, or maybe a patient who'd witnessed the attack. Instead, I saw Dr. Sarah Chun walking toward me, and I knew immediately that something was very wrong. Chun was a respected physician, someone I'd met during previous investigations. She was professional, articulate, and completely in control of her environment. The person walking toward me looked like her, but moved like something else entirely. Her gait was wrong, too fluid in some ways and too rigid in others. Her arms hung at her sides unnaturally, and her head was tilted at an angle that suggested her neck muscles weren't working properly. But it was her eyes that told me this wasn't a normal medical emergency. They were completely black. Not the pupils, but the entire visible portion of her eyes. Like dark marbles pressed into her skull, reflecting the flickering fluorescent lights. Above us, she was looking at me, but not seeing me as a person. I was something else to her. Something she wanted to attack. She opened her mouth, and the sound that came out was the same inhuman growling I'd heard from the lobby. Deep, wet, and completely wrong. It wasn't the sound of someone in pain or distress. It was the sound of a predator that had found its prey. That's when Dr. Chun launched herself at me with a speed that defied every assumption I had about human physical capability. She covered 15 feet in less than 2 seconds, her movements more like an animal than a person. I barely had time to draw my taser before she was on me, her hands reaching for my throat with fingers that had somehow grown longer and sharper than they should have been. I fired the taser at Dr. Chun before she could reach me. 50,000 volts hit her center mass, and she dropped to the floor like I'd cut her strings. For a moment, I thought it was over. I'd dealt with violent individuals before, and the taser had never failed to end a confrontation. But as I watched her convulse on the hospital floor, I realized this wasn't going to be like anything I'd experienced before. Most people stay down after being tased. The electrical shock disrupts their nervous system, causes muscle contractions, and leaves them disoriented for several minutes. Dr. Chun was back on her feet in less than 10 seconds. Not stumbling or confused, but moving with that same unnatural fluidity she'd shown before. The taser had slowed her down, but it hadn't stopped her. I backed away, pulling out my backup taser cartridge. In 12 years of bounty hunting, I'd never needed to use a second cartridge on the same person. But Chun was already moving toward me again, those black eyes fixed on my face with an intensity that made my skin crawl. She wasn't deterred by pain or fear. She was operating on some kind of base instinct that I didn't understand. The bite mark on her neck was more visible now that I was closer to her. It looked fresh, maybe a few hours old, with dark veins spreading outward from the wound like infection lines. The skin around it was swollen and discolored, suggesting whatever had bitten her was carrying something toxic. But that didn't explain her behavior or her physical capabilities. I fired the second taser cartridge, hitting her in the chest again. This time she only went down for 5 seconds before getting back up. The electrical shock wasn't having the same effect it should have on a human nervous system. Either she was on some kind of drug that made her resistant to pain, or her body was processing the electrical impulses differently than normal. That's when I heard the announcement over the hospital's public address system. Code Gray, all floors. This is not a drill. Code Gray, all floors. I'd heard that code before during my time in law enforcement. It meant active shooter, armed intruder, immediate threat to life and safety. But looking at Dr. Chun, I knew this wasn't about guns or conventional weapons. She lunged at me again, but this time I was ready. I sidestepped her attack and used her momentum to throw her into the wall. It was a move I'd learned in military training, designed to neutralize an attacker without causing permanent damage. She hit the wall hard enough to crack the plaster, but she was moving again before I could react. That's when I noticed her fingernails. They were longer than they should have been, yellowed and sharpened to points. They weren't normal human nails. They looked more like claws, designed for tearing and ripping. When she swiped at me, I could see scratches in my tactical vest where they'd made contact. Deep scratches that would have torn through regular clothing. I started backing toward the stairwell, keeping my eyes on Chun while trying to process what I was seeing. This wasn't a psychiatric episode or a drug reaction. This was something else entirely. Something that was changing her physically as well as mentally. The bite mark on her neck wasn't just a wound. It was the source of whatever was turning her into something that wasn't quite human anymore. My radio crackled with emergency traffic from across the city. Multiple units responding to incidents at hospitals throughout the metro area. Similar circumstances, similar behaviors. Patients attacking staff, security unable to contain the situations, requests for medical assistance. And hazmat teams. This wasn't isolated to Grady Memorial Hospital. It was happening everywhere. I reached the stairwell and started descending, but Chun followed me. She moved down the stairs differently than a normal person would, using her hands as much as her feet, like an animal navigating terrain. She was faster than me, more agile, and she didn't seem to tire. I had to use the handrails to swing myself around the corners, staying just ahead of her reaching claws. On the third floor, I encountered more chaos. Hospital staff were running in all directions, some screaming, others trying to maintain order. I saw 3 security guards attempting to restrain someone who moved like Chun had moved. Their tasers weren't working either. The person they were trying to control was a middle-aged man in a patient gown, but he was fighting with strength that seemed impossible for his size. I noticed the bite mark on his arm immediately. Fresh, deep, and surrounded by the same dark veins I'd seen on Chun's neck. Whatever was causing this condition was spreading through bite transmission, and it was spreading fast. I counted at least 6 more individuals exhibiting similar behavior throughout the floor, all with fresh bite wounds somewhere on their bodies. The infection pattern was becoming clear. One person would bite another, and within hours, the victim would begin exhibiting the same aggressive behavior and physical changes. It was like a virus, but one that worked faster than anything I'd encountered during my time in the military or law enforcement. The incubation period seemed to be less than 12 hours based on what I was observing. Chun was still pursuing me, but now she was joined by others. The man in the patient gown had broken free from the security guards and was following our trail. A nurse who'd been bitten was stumbling down the hallway, her medical scrubs torn and bloodied. They were all moving with that same unnatural gait, all focused on finding uninfected people to attack. I reached the 2nd floor and found a maintenance closet that I could lock from the inside. It was small, cramped, and filled with cleaning supplies, but it gave me a moment to catch my breath and think. I could hear them outside, scratching at the door, making those inhuman growling sounds. They knew I was in there, but they couldn't figure out how to get in. That's when I realized something crucial about their behavior. They were operating on instinct rather than reasoning. They could track me by scent and sound, but they couldn't solve simple problems like opening a locked door. They had enhanced physical capabilities, but their cognitive functions were severely impaired. That was information I could use. I activated my radio to monitor emergency frequencies. The situation was deteriorating rapidly across the entire metropolitan area. Hospitals were reporting dozens of incidents, with the number increasing every hour. Police departments were overwhelmed, unable to respond to all the calls for assistance. The National Guard was being mobilized, but nobody seemed to understand what they were dealing with. The CDC was mentioned frequently in the radio chatter. Teams were being dispatched to investigate what officials were calling an unknown pathogen. There was speculation about biological weapons, industrial accidents, and terrorist attacks. But from where I sat, listening to the infected trying to break down the door, I knew this was something else entirely. I checked my equipment while I waited. 2 empty taser cartridges, pepper spray, collapsible baton, and my backup pistol. I'd never fired the pistol in the line of duty. My entire career had been built on bringing fugitives back alive, using non-lethal methods whenever possible. But these weren't fugitives. They weren't even people anymore, not in any meaningful sense. The scratching at the door stopped suddenly. I could hear them moving away, their footsteps fading down the corridor. Either they'd lost interest, or they'd found something else to pursue. I waited another 5 minutes before opening the door, listening carefully for any sign of movement. The hallway was empty, but I could hear screaming from other parts of the hospital. The infection was spreading faster than the staff could contain it. I needed to get to the ground floor and find a way out of the building. But first, I had to understand more about what I was dealing with. I found Dr. Martinez in the emergency department. She was barricaded behind the nurses' station with 2 other staff members, all of them looking terrified. Martinez was the one who'd been screaming earlier, the sound that had first alerted me to the crisis. She was a trauma surgeon, someone who'd dealt with gunshot wounds and car accidents without flinching. Seeing her scared told me everything I needed to know about how serious this was. She recognized me immediately and motioned for me to join them behind the barricade. The emergency department was in chaos. Infected patients were wandering through the treatment areas, attacking anyone they encountered. The normal security measures weren't working. The infected could break through restraints, ignore pain, and coordinate their attacks in ways that suggested they were operating on shared instincts. Martinez told me what she'd observed. The first case had arrived early that morning. A CDC researcher named Dr. Sarah Chun, suffering from what appeared to be a severe allergic reaction. She'd been working late at the CDC facility and had been exposed to something during a containment breach. The symptoms seemed manageable at first, but they'd progressed rapidly. Within hours, Chun had become violent and aggressive. She'd attacked a nurse, biting her on the arm before security could intervene. The nurse had been treated for the bite wound, but she'd begun exhibiting similar symptoms within 6 hours. By afternoon, there were multiple cases throughout the hospital, all connected by bite transmission. The infected retained basic motor functions, but lost higher reasoning abilities. They could walk, run, climb, and use simple tools, but they couldn't communicate or solve complex problems. They were driven by what appeared to be an overwhelming hunger for human flesh, specifically targeting uninfected individuals. They could distinguish between infected and uninfected people through some mechanism that nobody understood. Martinez had been documenting the progression of symptoms. The initial bite wound would swell and develop dark veins radiating outward. Within 4 to 6 hours, the victim would begin showing signs of aggression and confusion. By 8 hours, they would completely lose their human personality and reasoning ability. By 12 hours, they would exhibit the full range of infected behaviors. The physical changes were equally disturbing. Enhanced strength and speed, improved reflexes, and altered pain perception. The infected could continue functioning despite injuries that would incapacitate a normal person. Their fingernails would grow longer and sharper, their teeth would become more prominent, and their eyes would turn completely black. But the most frightening aspect was their coordination. The infected didn't just attack randomly. They worked together, using pack tactics to corner victims. They could communicate through growls and body language, sharing information about prey locations and coordinating group attacks. It was like they were operating on a shared network of instincts. Martinez showed me bite wound documentation from the first few cases. The pattern was consistent across all victims. Deep puncture wounds from enhanced human teeth, surrounded by rapid tissue necrosis and infection. The saliva of the infected contained some kind of pathogen that spread through the bloodstream faster than any known virus or bacteria. I asked about treatment options, hoping there might be some way to reverse the infection. Martinez shook her head. They'd tried everything. Antibiotics, antivirals, surgical intervention, even experimental treatments. Nothing worked. Once someone was bitten, the progression was inevitable. The best they could do was contain the infected and protect the uninfected. The hospital's communication systems were failing. Phone lines were overloaded, internet connections were unstable, and the emergency radio network was overwhelmed with traffic. Information was becoming fragmented and unreliable. Nobody had a complete picture of what was happening across the city. What we did know was terrifying. Similar incidents were being reported at hospitals throughout the Southeast. The infection was spreading beyond Atlanta, carried by infected individuals who had managed to leave the initial outbreak sites. Transportation networks were inadvertently helping the pathogen spread faster than containment efforts could track it. Government response was escalating rapidly. The CDC had declared a public health emergency and was coordinating with FEMA and the Department of Defense. Quarantine procedures were being implemented around affected areas, but they were too late and too limited. The infection had already spread beyond any realistic containment perimeter. Martinez told me about the evacuation procedures that were being implemented. Essential personnel were being moved to secure facilities, while patients and visitors were being processed through screening stations. But the screening process was unreliable. People could be infected but not yet symptomatic, and they were being cleared to leave the quarantine zone. I realized that my decision to abandon the pursuit of Rodriguez had probably saved my life. If I'd followed him toward the MARTA station, I would have been caught in the open when the infection spread to the street level. The hospital, despite its dangers, was actually one of the safer places to be during the initial outbreak. The staff understood the threat and were taking appropriate precautions. But safety was relative. The infected were breaking through barriers, overwhelming security measures, and spreading throughout the building. We could hear them in the corridors, growing in number and becoming more aggressive. The barricades wouldn't hold indefinitely, and we needed an exit strategy. Martinez had been monitoring emergency broadcasts on a battery-powered radio. The situation outside was deteriorating rapidly. Police were reporting attacks throughout the city, with officers unable to stop the infected using conventional methods. The National Guard was being deployed, but they were equipped for riot control, not biological warfare. I studied the hospital's layout, looking for escape routes that would avoid the highest concentrations of infected. The emergency department had multiple exits, but they were all being monitored by infected individuals who seemed to understand that people would try to leave through those routes. We needed a different approach. The infected were learning. That was perhaps the most disturbing observation Martinez had made. They were adapting their behavior based on experience, becoming more efficient hunters. They were starting to set ambush, coordinate group attacks, and use the hospital's infrastructure to their advantage. Their cognitive abilities were impaired, but their predatory instincts were enhanced. I counted at least 20 infected individuals in the emergency department alone. They were moving through the treatment areas systematically, checking every room and closet for potential victims. Their search patterns were becoming more organized, suggesting they were sharing information and coordinating their efforts. The time for hiding was ending. Soon, they would find our location and overwhelm our defenses. I had to make another choice. Stay and fight, hoping that help would arrive before we were overrun, or attempt to escape and find safety elsewhere. Both options carried enormous risks, but staying meant certain death. Martinez was looking at me with the same expression Jenkins had shown in the lobby. She knew about my background, my training, my experience with dangerous situations. She was hoping I had answers, solutions, some way to get us out of this nightmare alive. But I was as scared and confused as she was, just better at hiding it. I made the decision to attempt an escape. Staying in the hospital meant being trapped with an increasing number of infected individuals in a building that was becoming more dangerous by the hour. Outside, at least we would have mobility and options. We could find vehicles, weapons, and other survivors who might be better equipped to deal with this crisis. The infected were closing in on our position. I could hear them testing the barriers, probing for weaknesses. It was time to move. Time to put my survival training to the test in a situation I'd never imagined. I checked my equipment one final time, took a deep breath, and prepared to lead Martinez and the others into whatever waited beyond the hospital walls. The first thing I needed to understand was how the infected tracked their prey. From my observations in the emergency department, they weren't just wandering randomly. They were hunting with purpose, using senses that seemed enhanced beyond normal human capability. I watched them for 20 minutes from behind our barricade, documenting their behavior patterns like I would study a fugitive's habits. They responded to sound first and most aggressively. Any noise above a whisper would draw them immediately, and they could pinpoint the source with startling accuracy. But it wasn't just volume that attracted them. They seemed to distinguish between different types of sounds. The beeping of medical equipment didn't interest them, But human voices, footsteps, or breathing would send them into an aggressive search pattern. Their sense of smell was equally developed. I watched one infected individual follow a scent trail through the hospital corridors, moving from room to room in a pattern that suggested he was tracking someone who had passed through hours earlier. They could detect the difference between infected and uninfected people through scent alone, which explained why they ignored each other but pursued us relentlessly. Movement was the third trigger. They responded to any motion within their line of sight, but their visual acuity seemed limited to detecting movement rather than identifying specific objects. I tested this by slowly moving a clipboard into their view. No response. But when I moved it quickly, 3 infected individuals immediately focused on the location. Temperature might have been a factor as well. I noticed they were drawn to areas where people had been recently, places that would still retain body heat. They would linger in rooms that had been occupied, seeming to sense something we couldn't detect. This suggested they had enhanced infrared perception or could detect heat signatures in ways normal humans couldn't. Understanding their sensory capabilities was crucial for planning our escape. We needed to move quietly, avoid leaving scent trails, minimize our movement when in their line of sight, and stay away from areas that might retain our body heat. It was like evading a pack of predators that had evolved specifically to hunt humans, but the infected had weaknesses too. Their enhanced physical capabilities came at the cost of cognitive function. They couldn't solve complex problems, plan beyond immediate objectives, or adapt to situations that required reasoning. They operated on instinct and immediate sensory input, which meant they could be predictable if you understood their behavioral patterns. I observed them attempting to break through our barricade. They would push against it, claw at it, and try to climb over it, but they couldn't figure out how to dismantle it systematically. They lacked the problem-solving ability to remove specific components or coordinate a sophisticated attack. Their efforts were purely physical and instinctual. They also showed signs of what I can only describe as attention deficit. If they couldn't reach a target within a few minutes, they would lose interest and move on to other stimuli. This wasn't strategy on their part, but rather an inability to maintain focus on long-term objectives. They lived entirely in the present moment, responding to immediate sensory input. Pain didn't deter them, but physical damage did slow them down. The infected individual I'd seen earlier had been shot twice by security guards before overwhelming them. The bullets hadn't stopped him, but they had affected his mobility. Severe structural damage to joints or major muscle groups would impair their movement, even if it wouldn't stop them completely. Their coordination abilities were limited to basic pack behavior. They could work together to surround prey or coordinate simple attacks, but they couldn't execute complex strategies. Their communication was limited to growls, body language, and what appeared to be pheromone signals. They couldn't share detailed information or plan sophisticated operations. Martinez had been taking notes on everything I observed, documenting behavioral patterns that might be useful for other survivors. She was thinking like a scientist even in this crisis, recognizing that information about the infected could save lives. Her medical training was helping her understand the biological aspects of what we were seeing. The infection progression was more complex than we'd initially realized. Martinez had been monitoring the timeline of symptoms in the early cases, and she'd identified distinct phases in the transformation process. The initial bite wound would begin showing signs of infection within 30 minutes. Dark veins would spread from the wound site, and the victim would develop a fever. Within 2 hours, behavioral changes would begin. Increased aggression, reduced pain sensitivity, and difficulty with complex reasoning. The victim would still be recognizably human at this stage, but their personality would start deteriorating. They would become irritable, confused, and prone to violent outbursts. By 4 hours, the physical changes would become apparent. Enhanced strength and speed, altered facial features, and the characteristic black eyes. The victim would lose most of their ability to communicate verbally, though they might still respond to simple commands or familiar voices. At 6 hours, the transformation would accelerate rapidly. Complete loss of human reasoning, enhanced predatory instincts, and the development of pack behavior. The victim would no longer recognize friends or family members as anything other than potential prey. By 8 hours, the transformation would be complete. The infected individual would exhibit all the enhanced physical capabilities and predatory behaviors we'd observed. They would be completely driven by the need to hunt and infect others, with no trace of their former human personality remaining. But Martinez had noticed something else in her observations. The infected seemed to deteriorate physically after the initial transformation. Their enhanced capabilities were temporary, lasting perhaps 72 hours before beginning to decline. The early cases were already showing signs of weakness, slower movement, and reduced sensory acuity. This suggested that the infection was ultimately fatal. The pathogen enhanced human capabilities initially, but it was also consuming the host's biological resources at an unsustainable rate. The infected weren't just mindless predators, they were dying, and their aggressive behavior was probably driven by the biological imperative to spread the infection before their bodies failed completely. This information was both encouraging and terrifying. Encouraging because it meant the infected wouldn't remain a threat indefinitely. Terrifying because it meant they would become increasingly desperate and aggressive as their condition deteriorated. A dying predator was often the most dangerous kind. I was developing a tactical assessment of our situation based on military principles I'd learned during my service. We were facing an enemy with superior physical capabilities, but inferior cognitive function. They had enhanced senses but predictable behavior patterns. They were numerous but unorganized. The key to survival was exploiting their weaknesses while avoiding their strengths. Stealth would be our primary strategy. Moving quietly, staying downwind when possible, avoiding areas where they might expect to find survivors. We needed to think like prey animals, using intelligence and planning to compensate for our physical disadvantages. Distraction was another viable tactic. The infected responded aggressively to stimuli, but they could be drawn away from their intended targets by louder sounds or stronger scents. We could use this behavior to create opportunities for movement or escape. Terrain advantage was crucial. The infected were stronger and faster than us, but they couldn't climb as well as humans, navigate complex obstacles, or plan routes that required reasoning. We needed to choose paths that favored intelligence over raw physical capability. Resource management would determine our long-term survival. Food, water, medical supplies, and weapons were all limited commodities in this new environment. We needed to prioritize items that would give us the greatest advantage in dealing with the infected while planning for extended survival. Information was perhaps our most valuable resource. Understanding the infected's behavior, tracking their movements, and maintaining communication with other survivors would be essential for making informed decisions. Knowledge about safe locations, supply caches, and escape routes could mean the difference between life and death. Martinez had been monitoring emergency broadcasts throughout our conversation, gathering intelligence about the situation beyond the hospital. The reports were becoming increasingly dire. The infection had spread throughout the Atlanta metropolitan area and was beginning to appear in surrounding cities. Transportation networks were carrying infected individuals faster than containment efforts could track them. Government response was escalating rapidly, but it was consistently behind the curve of the outbreak. Military units were being deployed, but they were trained for conventional warfare, not biological threats. Police departments were overwhelmed and unable to maintain order. Emergency services were breaking down as first responders became infected or abandoned their posts. The CDC was coordinating research efforts, but they were working from a severely compromised position. Many of their key personnel were trapped in infected areas, and their primary research facilities were no longer secure. They were sharing information with military biodefense units, but progress was slow. International response was beginning to develop. Other countries were implementing travel restrictions and border controls, recognizing that this outbreak could become a global pandemic. But the infection was already spreading beyond the initial outbreak zone, carried by people who were infected, but not yet symptomatic. Media coverage was spotty and unreliable. Communication networks were being overwhelmed by emergency traffic, and many broadcast facilities had been abandoned. Social media was filled with unverified reports and panic-driven speculation. Reliable information was becoming increasingly difficult to obtain. I realized that we were witnessing the collapse of organized society in real time. The institutions and systems that maintained order were failing one by one as the infection spread. Law enforcement, medical services, government coordination, and communication networks were all breaking down simultaneously. This meant that survival would depend on small groups of individuals working together rather than large-scale rescue operations. We couldn't count on military intervention or government assistance. We were on our own, and we needed to start thinking in terms of long-term self-sufficiency rather than short-term rescue. The infected were becoming more aggressive and organized as their numbers increased. What had started as individual attacks was evolving into coordinated group behavior. They were learning to work together, sharing information through their limited communication methods and developing more efficient hunting strategies. I counted at least 40 infected individuals in the hospital now, and their behavior was becoming more sophisticated. They were posting guards at exits, conducting systematic searches of each floor, and coordinating their movements to prevent survivors from escaping. Their cognitive limitations hadn't changed, but their instinctual behaviors were becoming more refined. Time was running out for our escape attempt. The longer we waited, the more organized the infected would become, and the smaller our chances of successful evacuation. We needed to move soon, while we still had the element of surprise and before they completely locked down the building. Martinez had identified other survivors scattered throughout the hospital, small groups of staff and patients who had managed to find secure locations and establish communication through the hospital's internal phone system. But these groups were isolated and running low on supplies. They needed coordination and leadership to have any chance of survival. I made the decision to attempt contact with these other survivor groups before beginning our escape. If we could coordinate simultaneous breakouts from multiple locations, we might be able to overwhelm the infected's ability to respond. It was a risk, but it offered better odds than trying to escape on our own. The plan required precise timing and clear communication. We would need to move simultaneously, using predetermined routes and rally points. Each group would need to create distractions to draw infected away from the other's escape routes. It was complex and dangerous, but it was our best chance for getting multiple groups out alive. I established contact with 6 other survivor groups using the hospital's phone system. Most were small, consisting of 2 to 4 people. One group had 7 individuals, including 2 security guards with weapons and tactical training. Another group included a maintenance worker who knew the hospital's service tunnels and alternate routes. We coordinated our timing for sunset, when reduced visibility might give us an additional advantage. Each group would begin their escape sequence at exactly the same time, moving toward predetermined rally points outside the hospital. If any group encountered overwhelming resistance, they were to abort and return to their secure location. The maintenance worker provided crucial intelligence about service routes that bypassed the main corridors. These tunnels connected different sections of the hospital and provided access to the parking structures without going through areas heavily populated by infected. They weren't marked on standard building plans, which meant the infected wouldn't know about them. We spent the remaining daylight hours preparing for the escape attempt, gathering supplies, planning routes, identifying fallback positions, and establishing communication protocols. Each person was assigned specific responsibilities and backup objectives. We couldn't afford confusion or hesitation once the operation began. Martinez had been monitoring the infected's behavior patterns throughout the day, and she'd noticed they were less active during bright daylight hours. Their enhanced senses seemed to be calibrated for low-light conditions, which meant they might be temporarily disadvantaged during our escape window. This observation would prove crucial for our survival. As sunset approached, I conducted final equipment checks and reviewed our escape plan one more time. We had one chance to get this right, and failure would mean certain death for all the survivor groups. The infected were waiting in the corridors outside, and they were getting more aggressive as darkness fell. The sunset escape plan began at exactly 6:30, when the last rays of daylight were filtering through the hospital windows. We'd observed that the infected became more sluggish during bright light, and we hoped this would give us a crucial advantage. Martinez and I were leading the largest group, consisting of 5 people including a respiratory therapist named Johnson and a security guard named Williams who had military experience. Our route took us through the service tunnels that the maintenance worker had described. These passages were narrow, poorly lit, and filled with pipes and electrical conduits, but they bypassed the main corridors where the infected were concentrated. Williams took point, using his tactical training to navigate the confined spaces, while I covered our rear with Martinez and the others between us. The tunnels were claustrophobic and disorienting. Every sound seemed amplified in the enclosed space, and we had to move carefully to avoid making noise that might alert the infected to our presence. The respiratory therapist was struggling with the confined space, but she maintained discipline and followed our movement protocols. We could hear the infected moving through the hospital above us. Their footsteps echoed through the ventilation systems, and occasionally we could hear them testing doors and barriers. They seemed to be conducting a systematic search of the building, growing more organized as their numbers increased. The coordination I'd observed earlier was becoming more sophisticated. 20 minutes into our escape, we encountered our first major obstacle. The tunnel we'd planned to use had been blocked by debris from structural damage caused by the infected's earlier rampage. Ceiling tiles, broken pipes, and overturned equipment created a barrier that would take significant time and noise to clear. Williams recommended backtracking to find an alternate route, but I was concerned about time. The other survivor groups were depending on our simultaneous breakout to create the distractions they needed for their own escapes. If we delayed too long, the entire coordination plan would collapse. I made the decision to continue forward through a maintenance shaft that paralleled our intended route. It was smaller, more difficult to navigate, and would require us to move single file, but it would keep us on schedule. Williams disagreed with the decision, arguing that the confined space would make us vulnerable if we encountered infected. But I overruled him. The maintenance shaft was barely large enough for an adult to crawl through. We had to move our equipment ahead of us and communicate through whispered signals. The metal ductwork amplified every sound, and I was terrified that the infected would hear us moving through the building's infrastructure. Martinez was documenting everything in a small notebook, recording our route, timing, and observations about infected behavior. She understood that this information might be crucial for other survivors, and she was maintaining scientific discipline even under extreme stress. Her medical training was helping her stay focused on details that might seem unimportant, but could save lives later. We emerged from the maintenance shaft in the hospital's laundry facility, 3 floors below our starting point. The area was empty of infected, but we could hear them moving through the corridors nearby. Our timing was critical now. We had to reach the parking structure before the other groups began their diversionary actions. The laundry facility had multiple exits, but most led directly into areas we knew were populated by infected. Williams identified a service elevator that connected to the parking structure, but using it would require electrical power that might not be reliable. We also had the option of emergency stairs, but they would expose us to infected on multiple floors. I chose the emergency stairs, reasoning that we could control our exposure by moving quickly and quietly between floors. We would have to pass through infected territory, but we could choose our timing and routes. The elevator was too unpredictable, and if it failed, we would be trapped. The stairwell was eerily quiet when we entered. Emergency lighting cast strange shadows on the concrete walls, and every sound seemed to echo endlessly. We moved down 2 floors without incident, but on the 3rd floor, we heard infected moving through the corridors just beyond the stairwell door. Williams held up his hand, signaling us to freeze. Through the small window in the stairwell door, we could see at least 6 infected individuals moving through the hallway. They were searching methodically, checking every room and closet. Their behavior was more organized than what I'd observed earlier, suggesting they were learning and adapting. We waited for 10 minutes while the infected completed their search and moved on. During that time, I observed their search patterns more carefully. They were working in pairs, with one individual checking rooms, while the other maintained watch in the corridor. This level of coordination suggested they were developing tactical awareness beyond simple predatory instincts. When the corridor cleared, we continued down the stairwell toward the parking level. But as we reached the ground floor, we heard radio chatter from the other survivor groups. One team had encountered heavy resistance and was requesting immediate assistance. Another group was reporting successful evacuation, but had lost 2 members during their escape. The coordination plan was breaking down. Some groups were succeeding, others were failing, and the infected were responding to the multiple escape attempts by increasing their own organization. They were learning from each encounter, becoming more effective at preventing survivors from leaving the building. Williams wanted to abort our mission and return to the emergency department, but I knew that was no longer an option. The infected would have discovered our original location by now, and returning would mean walking into a trap. We had to continue forward and adapt to the changing situation. We reached the parking structure without further incident, but the facility was not empty. At least 12 infected individuals were wandering through the garage, checking vehicles and investigating potential hiding places. They weren't moving randomly anymore. They were conducting organized patrols, covering specific areas in patterns that suggested they understood the building's layout. Our planned rally point was in the center of the parking structure, near the main vehicle exit, but reaching it would require crossing open space where we would be visible to multiple infected patrols. The original plan had assumed we would outnumber the infected in the parking area, but the situation had changed dramatically. I made another tactical decision that would haunt me for the rest of the night. Instead of attempting to reach the rally point, I chose to secure transportation immediately and evacuate our group independently. It meant abandoning the coordination plan and potentially leaving other survivors without the support they needed, but it offered our best chance of survival. Williams located a hospital security vehicle that had been abandoned near the service entrance. The keys were still in the ignition, and the vehicle appeared to be undamaged. It was an SUV with reinforced windows and doors, designed for security. Patrols but adequate for our escape needs. But starting the vehicle would create noise that would immediately alert every infected individual in the parking structure. We would have seconds to reach the exit before they converged on our location. The timing had to be perfect, and there would be no opportunity for mistakes. Martinez volunteered to create a distraction while the rest of us reached the vehicle. She would use medical supplies to create noise in the opposite corner of the parking structure, drawing the infected away from our escape route. It was an incredibly brave offer, but it would put her at enormous risk. I rejected her proposal and instead chose to use the vehicle's security features to our advantage. The SUV was equipped with emergency lights and a public address system. I could activate these systems to create confusion among the infected while we made our escape. It was risky, but it didn't require sacrificing any member of our group. The plan required split-second timing. Williams would start the engine while I activated the emergency systems. The respiratory therapist and Martinez would secure the doors, while Johnson provided security watch. We would have perhaps 30 seconds to reach the exit before the infected could organize a response. As we prepared to execute the plan, I heard gunfire from somewhere else in the parking structure. One of the other survivor groups was fighting their way out, using weapons they'd acquired from hospital security. The sound was drawing infected from throughout the building, creating both opportunity and danger for our escape. Williams started the engine while I activated every emergency system the vehicle possessed. Flashing lights, sirens, and loudspeakers, all activated simultaneously, creating a cacophony that sent the infected into a frenzy of confused activity. They were responding to multiple stimuli simultaneously, unable to focus on our specific location. We reached the parking structure. Exit without direct confrontation, but the infected were already adapting to our tactics. They were learning to ignore diversionary sounds and focus on the actual sources of activity. Their predatory instincts were becoming more refined with each encounter. The streets outside the hospital were chaos. Abandoned vehicles, debris, and bodies were scattered across the roadways. Emergency vehicles sat empty with their doors open, suggesting that first responders had either fled or been overwhelmed. The normal sounds of urban life had been replaced by something else entirely. I could see other infected individuals moving through the streets, but they were scattered and disorganized compared to the coordinated groups inside the hospital. The open environment seemed to disperse their pack behavior, making them easier to avoid, but harder to predict. We drove toward the interstate, hoping to reach the temporary emergency shelters that had been established outside the immediate outbreak zone. But the radio traffic suggested that many of these facilities had already been overrun or abandoned. The infection was spreading faster than containment efforts could establish safe areas. Martinez was monitoring emergency broadcasts while I navigated through the abandoned streets. The situation was deteriorating rapidly across the entire region. Military units were reporting contact with infected groups in areas that should have been secure. The infection was spreading through mechanisms that authorities didn't understand and couldn't control. The CDC was coordinating research efforts from backup facilities, but their progress was limited by the rapid evolution of the crisis. Each report suggested that the infected were developing new capabilities or behaviors that hadn't been observed in earlier cases. They were adapting faster than scientists could study them. International response was escalating as well. Several countries had implemented complete travel bans from the affected region, and there was discussion of more extreme containment measures. The World Health Organization was coordinating global response efforts, but they were working with incomplete and constantly changing information. As we drove through the empty streets, I realized that we were witnessing the end of the world as we'd known it. The institutions and systems that had maintained civilization were collapsing faster than anyone had imagined possible. The infection wasn't just creating monsters from human beings. It was destroying the social structures that allowed organized society to function. But we had survived the hospital. Against overwhelming odds, we had gathered information, coordinated with other survivors, and successfully escaped from a building filled with infected predators. The knowledge we'd gained and the tactics we'd developed would be crucial for whatever challenges lay ahead. Williams was already planning our next moves. He knew about National Guard staging areas that might still be secure, and he had contacts in law enforcement who might have access to resources and information. His military experience was becoming invaluable as we transitioned from escape mode to survival mode. The respiratory therapist had family in a rural area north of Atlanta. She believed they might have established some kind of safe zone away from the major population centers where the infection was spreading. Rural areas might offer better opportunities for long-term survival, away from the dense concentrations of infected individuals. Martinez wanted to find other medical personnel who might be working on treatment or prevention strategies. She believed that understanding the biological mechanisms of the infection was crucial for developing effective countermeasures. Her scientific training was driving her to seek solutions rather than just survival. Johnson was focused on immediate, practical needs: food, water, fuel, weapons, and secure shelter. He understood that survival would depend on meeting basic human requirements while avoiding the infected. His maintenance background gave him skills in repairing equipment and improvising solutions to practical problems. As for me, I was thinking about information networks. My experience as a bounty hunter had taught me that knowledge was the most valuable commodity in any crisis. We needed to find other survivors, share information about infected behavior, and coordinate efforts to establish safe zones. The radio crackled with a transmission from one of the other hospital survivor groups. They had successfully evacuated and were requesting a rally point for regrouping. Their message included information about infected behavior patterns they'd observed during their escape, confirming many of our own observations. I responded to their transmission, sharing our location and suggesting a meeting point outside the immediate outbreak zone. Coordination between survivor groups would be essential for long-term survival. We needed to pool our resources, share information, and work together to establish secure areas. But even as we made these plans, I could see infected individuals in the distance, moving through the abandoned streets with that distinctive unnatural gait. They were spreading outward from the initial outbreak sites, carried by some instinct to find new prey. The infection was becoming a wave that would sweep across the entire region. The long night was just beginning, and our escape from the hospital was only the first challenge we would face. Ahead lay a world transformed, where the rules of civilization no longer applied and survival depended on adapting to threats that no human had ever faced before. The drive-through downtown Atlanta revealed the true scope of what we were facing. What had started as isolated incidents in hospitals had spread throughout the city in less than 12 hours. Abandoned emergency vehicles sat in intersections with their doors open, suggesting first responders had either fled or been overwhelmed. Store windows were shattered, not from looting but from infected individuals who had broken through while pursuing prey. We encountered our first infected group on Peachtree Street, about 6 blocks from the hospital. 8 individuals moving together in a loose formation, checking abandoned vehicles and investigating potential hiding places. Their coordination was more sophisticated than what I'd observed in the hospital. They were working as a unit, with some members serving as scouts while others maintained security positions. Williams slowed the vehicle, and we observed them for several minutes. These infected showed signs of being in the later stages of the transformation process. Their movements were more fluid, their sensory awareness seemed heightened, and they demonstrated clear pack behavior. But I also noticed signs of physical deterioration that confirmed Martinez's earlier observations about the infection's progression. Several members of the group showed visible weakness in their movements. They were slower than the newly infected individuals we'd encountered in the hospital, and their coordination was becoming more instinctual and less precise. The infection was consuming their biological resources, and while it enhanced their capabilities initially, it was ultimately fatal to the host organism. This observation gave me hope for long-term survival. If the infected population would naturally decline after 72 hours, then survivors who could avoid contact during the initial outbreak period might face manageable numbers of remaining threats. But it also meant the infected would become increasingly desperate as their condition deteriorated. We continued through the city, avoiding major roads where we might encounter large groups of infected or military roadblocks. My bounty hunting experience had taught me to navigate urban environments using alternate routes that most people wouldn't know about. Service roads, industrial areas, and residential neighborhoods offered better concealment than highways or main streets. The radio traffic was becoming more organized as military units established communication networks and coordination protocols. But the reports they were sharing painted a grim picture of the situation. The infection had spread beyond Atlanta into surrounding cities and was appearing in locations hundreds of miles from the original outbreak zone. Transportation networks had inadvertently accelerated the spread of the infection. Infected individuals, who were still in the early stages of transformation, had boarded flights, trains, and buses before their condition became apparent. By the time symptoms developed, they were in distant cities where local authorities had no warning about what they were dealing with. The CDC was coordinating with military biodefense units, but their research was hampered by the loss of primary facilities and key personnel. Many of their scientists were trapped in infected areas, and their laboratory equipment had been destroyed or abandoned. They were essentially starting from scratch while the crisis escalated around them. International response was becoming more aggressive. Several countries had implemented complete quarantine of the affected region, with military enforcement of travel restrictions. There was growing discussion about more extreme containment measures, including the possibility of nuclear sterilization of outbreak zones if conventional methods failed. But the infection was already beyond any realistic containment perimeter. Reports were coming in from cities across the southeast, and there were unconfirmed sightings in other regions. The pathogen was spreading faster than authorities could track it, carried by people who were infected but not yet symptomatic. We reached the rally point that I'd arranged with the other hospital survivor groups around 9 o'clock that evening. It was a truck stop on Interstate 285, chosen because it offered multiple escape routes and was outside the immediate outbreak zone. But when we arrived, we found only 2 other vehicles and 7 survivors from the original hospital groups. The other teams had encountered varying levels of success during their escape attempts. One group had lost 3 members to infected attacks, while another had been completely overrun. The survivors who'd made it to the rally point were shaken, exhausted, and carrying disturbing information about how rapidly the infected were evolving. Dr. Patterson, a cardiologist who'd escaped with the second group, reported that the infected were developing new hunting strategies. They were learning to set ambush, coordinate complex attacks, and use the hospital's infrastructure to their advantage. Their cognitive limitations remained, but their predatory instincts were becoming more refined with each encounter. The security guards who'd survived the escape provided tactical intelligence about infected combat capabilities. Standard law enforcement weapons and tactics were proving inadequate against opponents who could absorb significant damage and continue attacking. The infected's enhanced physical capabilities, combined with their apparent insensitivity to pain, made them extremely difficult to stop with conventional means. But they'd also identified weaknesses that could be exploited. The infected were vulnerable to severe structural damage, particularly to joints and major muscle groups. They couldn't function effectively with broken bones or severed tendons, even if they didn't experience pain from these injuries. Fire was also effective, though dangerous to use in enclosed spaces. Martinez shared her medical observations with the other survivors, including the timeline of infection progression and the evidence for eventual host organism failure. This information was crucial for understanding how long we might need to survive before the infected population began declining naturally. The group decided to continue moving north, away from the major population centers where the infection was most concentrated. Rural areas offered better opportunities for long-term survival, with lower population density, fewer infected individuals, and better access to natural resources like water and food sources. But leaving the urban area also meant abandoning potential. Rescue by military or government forces. The official response was focused on major cities and transportation hubs, and survivors in remote areas might be overlooked by evacuation efforts. We were choosing self-reliance over the possibility of official assistance. Williams had identified a National Guard armory about 60 miles north of Atlanta that might contain weapons and supplies useful for long-term survival. His military contacts suggested it had been evacuated during the initial response, but the facility itself might still be secure. It would give us access to equipment designed for extended field operations. The respiratory therapist, Johnson, still believed her family's rural property offered the best long-term survival option. It was isolated, defensible, and had independent water and power systems. But reaching it would require traveling through areas where the infection status was unknown, and there was no guarantee her family had survived the initial outbreak. Patterson wanted to reach the CDC's backup research facility in Birmingham, Alabama. He believed that contributing to treatment development was more important than individual survival, and his medical expertise might be valuable for research efforts. But the facility's current status was unknown, and traveling there might mean walking into another outbreak zone. As we debated our options, the radio crackled with an emergency broadcast from FEMA. They were establishing emergency shelters in designated areas outside the outbreak zone, but they warned that capacity was limited and access would be controlled by military personnel. The message suggested that organized rescue efforts were still possible, but only for those who could reach the designated areas. I made the decision to split our group. Those who wanted to attempt reaching the FEMA shelters could continue south toward the designated areas, while others could pursue alternative survival strategies. It was a difficult choice, but it recognized that different people had different skills, resources, and risk tolerances. Martinez chose to come with me toward Williams's National Guard armory. Her medical skills would be valuable for any survivor group, and she was committed to documenting information about the infected that might help others. Patterson decided to attempt reaching the CDC facility, believing his research background could contribute to treatment development. The respiratory therapist and 2 other survivors chose to head toward the FEMA shelter areas, hoping that government assistance would provide better long-term security than independent survival efforts. It was a reasonable choice, though I had concerns about the government's ability to maintain large refugee populations during a crisis of this magnitude. We transferred supplies and equipment between vehicles, ensuring each group had adequate resources for their chosen path. Food, water, medical supplies, weapons, and communication equipment were divided based on group size and anticipated needs. It was an emotional separation, knowing we might never see each other again. As the groups prepared to separate, I shared the tactical information I'd gathered about infected behavior, communication patterns, and hunting strategies. This knowledge had kept us alive during the hospital escape, and it might be crucial for other survivors facing similar situations. Information was our most valuable commodity now. Williams and I, along with Martinez and Johnson, headed north on secondary roads toward the National Guard armory. The route took us through small towns and rural areas where the infection might be less concentrated, but it also meant traveling through unfamiliar territory where we might encounter unexpected threats. The abandoned vehicle situation was becoming more complex as we moved away from Atlanta. Many cars had been abandoned by people fleeing the outbreak, but others showed signs of violent encounters with infected individuals. Bloodstains, broken windows, and scattered personal belongings told stories of unsuccessful escape attempts. We encountered our first rural infected group around midnight, near a small town called Commerce. 6 individuals moving along the main road, apparently following the same route that fleeing civilians had used. They were in various stages of the infection progression, with some showing the physical deterioration that Martinez had documented. The rural infected behaved differently than their urban counterparts. They seemed less coordinated but more aggressive, possibly because they had less competition for prey and fewer environmental obstacles to navigate. Their hunting patterns were more direct and violent, though also more predictable. We avoided direct contact by using agricultural roads that paralleled the main highway. My bounty hunting experience had taught me to identify alternate routes that most people wouldn't consider, and these skills were proving invaluable for avoiding both infected groups and potential military roadblocks. The radio traffic suggested that rural areas were experiencing their own unique challenges. Isolated infected individuals were spreading the infection to small communities that had no warning or preparation. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed, and communication with state and federal authorities was sporadic. Farm communities were reporting infected wildlife, suggesting that the pathogen could cross species barriers under certain circumstances. This development was particularly concerning because it meant the infection could persist in animal populations even after the human outbreak was contained. We reached the National Guard Armory around 3 o'clock in the morning. The facility was indeed abandoned, but it had been secured before evacuation. The main buildings were locked, and the perimeter fencing was intact. Williams's military knowledge allowed us to identify weak points in the security that we could exploit without creating obvious signs of entry. The armory contained weapons, ammunition, communication equipment, and field supplies that would be invaluable for long-term survival. But it also represented a commitment to armed resistance rather than evacuation to safety. Once we accessed military weapons, we would be crossing a line that might make us targets for government forces as well as infected individuals. Williams argued that the situation had already deteriorated beyond the point where conventional rescue was possible. The government was losing control of the crisis, and survivors would need military-grade equipment to defend themselves against both infected groups and other desperate survivors. Self-defense was becoming more important than cooperation with authorities. Martinez was concerned about the legal implications of accessing military equipment without authorization. Her medical ethics training emphasized cooperation with authorities and following established protocols. But she also recognized that normal legal frameworks might not apply during a civilization-ending crisis. I made the decision to access the armory based on my assessment of the tactical situation. The infected were becoming more dangerous as they adapted to human resistance, and other survivor groups might become hostile as resources became scarce. We needed every advantage we could obtain for long-term survival. The armory contained M4 rifles, pistols, body armor, communication equipment, and field rations designed for extended operations. There were also medical supplies, water purification systems, and camping equipment suitable for establishing a secure base of operations. It was like finding a treasure trove of survival resources. But accessing these supplies also made us responsible for using them effectively. Military equipment required training and maintenance, and misuse could be more dangerous than helpful. Williams began training Martinez and Johnson in basic weapon safety and tactical movement, recognizing that our survival might depend on everyone's ability to contribute to group defense. As dawn approached, we established a temporary base in the armory facility and began planning our next moves. The building was defensible, had independent power and water systems, and contained enough supplies to support our group for several weeks. It could serve as a staging area for longer-term survival planning. The radio brought news of major government decisions being made in response to the crisis. Military units were being repositioned for large-scale containment operations, and there was discussion of declaring martial law in affected areas. The official response was escalating toward wartime measures, with implications for all survivors in the region. But I also heard reports of successful civilian resistance efforts. Small groups of survivors were establishing secure areas, sharing information about infected behavior, and developing effective defense strategies. The bounty hunting skills that had kept me alive during the initial outbreak were proving valuable for the longer-term challenge of rebuilding some form of organized society. The 24 hours that had begun with me tracking a bail jumper through downtown Atlanta had ended with me leading a group of survivors and accessing military weapons for defense against infected predators. Everything I'd thought I understood about justice, law enforcement, and social order had been fundamentally transformed. But we were alive. We had information about how to survive in this new world. We had resources and equipment that would help us defend ourselves and assist other survivors. Most importantly, we had hope that human civilization could adapt and survive, even in the face of threats that no one had imagined possible. The infection had taken everything we'd known about normal life, but it had also revealed capabilities and instincts that we didn't know we possessed. My bounty hunting experience had become survival training. Martinez's medical knowledge had become tactical intelligence. Williams's military background had become leadership skills for a war against an enemy that didn't follow any conventional rules. As the sun rose on October 16, 2024, I realized that the old world had ended forever. But a new world was beginning, and we were going to be part of building it. The lessons we'd learned during those first 24 hours would be the foundation for whatever came next, and the information we'd gathered might help other survivors facing the same impossible choices we'd confronted. That's why I'm sharing this story with you now. Not because I want to relive those terrifying hours, but because the knowledge we gained might save your life if you ever face similar circumstances. The infected are still out there, evolving and adapting, and new outbreaks are always possible. What we learned about their behavior, their weaknesses, and their patterns could be the difference between life and death for future survivors.